The streets of New York were alive with the relentless energy that defined the city, a city that never stopped moving, never stopped evolving. The hum of taxis, the sound of footsteps tapping against the sidewalk, and the murmur of voices blended in a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. Among the crowd of well-dressed pedestrians and eager tourists, a man walked with a calm yet determined air. James Carter, a name synonymous with success, power, and influence, had returned to the very city that had witnessed the birth of his empire. At 42, James had seen it all, from the struggles of starting a business with nothing but an idea to becoming the owner of a multi-million-dollar luxury brand. His company, renowned for its exclusivity, fine craftsmanship, and impeccable service, was now a name that echoed through the halls of the most elite corners of society. But behind the facade of high-end boutiques, designer collections, and tailored suits, James knew that something was off, something he couldn't ignore any longer. He had built his empire from the ground up, but as the years went on, he began to notice a troubling pattern in his stores, one that was not about the quality of the products or the elegance of the design, but about how certain customers were treated. The attitude of exclusivity that he had initially envisioned had morphed into something more sinister, an unspoken barrier that kept certain people, those who didn't look the part, who didn't fit the stereotype of a luxury customer, out of the experience. This subtle but pervasive discrimination was something James couldn't ignore any longer. It troubled him because, at its core, his brand was built on the idea that luxury should be accessible to everyone who valued it, not just those who could afford it. So James decided to go undercover, not as the CEO of his company, but as a regular customer. He wanted to see how his stores operated when there was no expectation of preferential treatment. How would his staff, the same staff who had been trained to represent the best of his brand, treat him when they didn't know who he was? Would they judge him by his appearance, or would they see beyond that, offering the same level of service to him as they would to a high-profile celebrity or a rich businessman? Dressed in a plain black jacket, jeans, and a baseball cap, James stepped into the store that had become one of his proudest accomplishments. The store stood in one of the most coveted locations on Fifth Avenue, an epitome of sophistication and luxury. The store's polished glass facade reflected the city's skyline, while inside, the meticulously arranged displays of watches, jewelry, and fashion exuded wealth, status, and elegance. Everything about it spoke to a world of exclusivity and refinement. James took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The soft chime of the bell above signaled his entrance, and the moment he stepped inside, he was enveloped by the scent of expensive cologne and the soft hum of ambient jazz music. The atmosphere was serene, controlled, and entirely in line with the brand he had worked so hard to cultivate. Yet despite the luxury surrounding him, something felt out of place. It wasn't the store's decor or the products themselves, but the invisible divide he suspected existed between the customers who were treated as worthy of this experience and those who weren't. He wandered over to a display case filled with high-end watches, pieces he knew well, pieces that had been chosen by him for their craftsmanship and prestige. He picked one up, admiring its weight and design. The watch was beautiful, but James's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't help but think about the world of luxury, how it was supposed to be about quality, not about who you were or how you looked. Was that still the case, or had his brand become a haven for judgment? It didn't take long for him to notice Richard Coleman, the store's franchise owner, standing near the counter. Richard was in his mid-50s, with graying hair and a sharply tailored suit that betrayed his age. His posture was stiff, almost military, and his movements were precise, as if he were constantly calculating his next step. He was talking to a woman in a designer dress, his voice low, almost rehearsed, as if every word had been carefully practiced for years. To Richard, every customer was an opportunity to uphold the store's image, to ensure that everything remained perfect, pristine, and, above all, exclusive. James observed from a distance, noting how Richard's attention shifted the moment he noticed him. The polite smile that had been on his face moments before disappeared, replaced by a subtle frown, as if he had suddenly noticed something that didn't belong. It was a quick shift, so brief that only someone truly paying attention would catch it. James, however, did. Richard's eyes scanned him, taking in the casual attire, the baseball cap, the lack of obvious wealth. It was clear to James that Richard had already formed an opinion about him based solely on appearance. Undeterred, James decided to test the waters. He approached Richard, still holding the watch in his hands, and asked in the most casual tone he could muster, "Excuse me, could you tell me more about this watch?" Richard's response was swift, almost mechanical. He took a step toward James, but the warmth of his earlier customer service was gone. His tone was polite, but it was clear that he was no longer seeing a potential customer. He was seeing someone who didn't belong. "That's one of our limited edition model," he said, his voice clipped. "Very exclusive. Might not be what you're looking for." James, sensing the judgment in Richard's tone, decided to press further. He had anticipated this moment, and now it was time to see how far the bias ran. "Oh, why is that?" he asked, maintaining his composure. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "It's a very high-end piece, quite expensive. Maybe you'd be interested in something more accessible." James felt a flicker of irritation inside, but he kept his tone even. He wasn't here to get angry. He was here to understand. "I like high-end pieces," he replied calmly. "What makes this one special?" Richard let out a small sigh, as though he were explaining something tedious. "It's crafted by one of the finest watchmakers in Switzerland," he said almost dismissively. "The materials are top tier, and the craftsmanship is unparalleled. It's a collector's item, very limited." James nodded thoughtfully, placing the watch back in the display case. "Sounds impressive. How much does it cost?" Richard hesitated, eyeing James as though weighing the cost of answering the question. "Well, $122,000, he said, almost reluctantly. "But as I said, we have other options that might be more in line with your budget." James smiled, but internally his frustration was mounting. He had been judged, dismissed, and spoken to as if he were undeserving of even a moment's attention. The judgment wasn't based on who he was, but on how he appeared. And in that moment, James knew that his suspicions were correct. The culture of exclusivity that had grown within his stores had gone far beyond what he had ever intended. This visit wasn't just about observing, it was about facing the reality of what his brand had become. And now James had a choice to make. Would he continue to let this culture thrive, or would he take the necessary steps to make things right? As he walked out of the store, his mind was already racing, plotting his next move. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The crisp morning air greeted James as he stepped out onto Fifth Avenue once again. The city felt alive, its energy infectious. But to him, the pulse of New York now seemed almost jarring. He had come for answers, and what he had witnessed in his store the previous day had raised more questions than it had answered. The scene with Richard, the subtle dismissals, the barely concealed judgments, all of it weighed heavily on him. His mind was clouded with frustration, but a part of him knew that the first step toward change had already begun. As James made his way back to the store, he reflected on the decision he had made to return undercover. The idea had always been to gain an unfiltered view of what was truly happening behind the glossy windows of his business, but now more than ever, he realized how necessary this move had been. He had seen the attitudes that his staff, his managers carried with them. He had witnessed firsthand how easily a culture of exclusion could take root, even in a place that prided itself on luxury and refinement. When he arrived at the store, the scene was much quieter than it had been the day before. James stepped closer, doing his best to maintain a casual air. But as he moved, he overheard snippets of their conversation, enough to make his blood boil. Richard's voice, low but audible, carried a dismissive tone that made it clear he was speaking about customers, not in terms of their worth as individuals, but as financial transactions. "I don't care if he's a potential customer," Richard was saying, his words clipped. "We've got standards to maintain. Don't let anyone get too comfortable." Sarah's voice was almost a whisper, but James could still make out her words. "But he's just looking at the watches. He hasn't done anything wrong." Richard scoffed, his voice lowering even further. "Just watch him. Keep an eye on him. We can't let every person walk in here and act like they own the place. We need to protect the brand." James stood still for a moment, absorbing the venom in Richard's words. It wasn't just about the store's reputation anymore. It wasn't just about the luxury items or the high-end brands. It was about a deeper, more insidious issue, a culture of judgment and exclusion that was woven into the very fabric of the business. What had once been an enterprise built on elegance and sophistication had become a breeding ground for elitism and disdain. His eyes met Sarah's briefly, and she quickly looked away. She had heard it too, but she didn't speak up. She didn't challenge Richard's words. For a moment, James wondered if she, too, was complicit in this toxic environment. Or was she simply afraid? Afraid of losing her job, her position, her chance at upward mobility within a company that so clearly valued the wrong things? It didn't matter now. James had seen enough. The decision was made. He approached the counter, his steps deliberate. As he did, Richard caught sight of him and immediately straightened up, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. James, however, didn't break his stride. He walked right up to the counter and stood face to face with Richard. "Good morning, Richard," James said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of authority that immediately demanded attention. Richard's smile faltered, the tightness in his posture evident as he attempted to mask his unease. "Mr. Carter, I wasn't expecting you," he said, his words strained. "Is there something I can help you with today?" James studied him for a moment, considering his response. The man standing before him had been the embodiment of arrogance, a man so certain of his position that he had felt entitled to make assumptions based on nothing but appearance. And now, standing here in front of him, James saw the cracks in the mask. Richard's arrogance was nothing more than a shield, a fragile one at that. "I've seen enough," James said quietly. "I've seen how you treat your customers, Richard, the way you speak about them, the assumptions you make. This isn't the image of the brand I built. This isn't what I stand for." Richard's face flushed, but he quickly regained his composure. "I don't understand what you mean," he said, his voice edging toward defensive. "We've built a strong brand here, Mr. Carter. We've catered to the clientele who know how to appreciate quality." James shook his head, cutting him off. "You've catered to a clientele who only appreciates quality if it comes wrapped in the right package, the right image, the right income bracket. That's not luxury. That's elitism, Richard. And it's toxic." Richard's eyes widened slightly, as if the words had struck him harder than he had anticipated. But instead of apologizing, he took a step back, trying to deflect the blame. "This is how things work, Mr. Carter. We need to maintain an image, a standard. It's not personal." "No," James replied, his voice firm now. "It is personal, and it's about time you realize that. This isn't about your idea of standards. This is about human decency, Richard. It's about treating people with respect, regardless of how they look or how much money they have. It's about valuing them for who they are, not for what they can buy." For a moment, there was silence. Richard stood motionless, his jaw tightening, as if he were trying to find the right words. But there were no words left. The truth had already been spoken. James took a deep breath, his decision final. "This store, this brand, it's changing. You won't be part of it anymore, Richard. Effective immediately, your franchise agreement is terminated." Richard's face drained of color, his eyes widening in disbelief. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice rising. "I've been with this company for years. You can't just throw me out like this." James's gaze hardened. "I can, and I will. Your behavior is a liability, and I won't let it tarnish everything this brand stands for." As Richard opened his mouth to protest, James turned away, his resolve firm. There would be no turning back now. He had made his decision, and the brand he had built would no longer be complicit in the culture of exclusion that had taken root. It was time for a new era to begin. The door chime rang softly as James Carter stepped out of the store, his mind still racing. The tension of the confrontation with Richard was still fresh in his mind, but there was no time to dwell on it. The decision had been made. The shift in his company was already underway, but the road ahead was uncertain. The store had been built on ideals that had become distorted over time, and though Richard was no longer a part of the picture, there were still many layers to peel back. As James walked down Fifth Avenue, the city's pulse surrounded him. Every person he passed, every sound, every corner seemed to echo with a reminder of how much had yet to be done. This was just one store, one small corner of a much larger empire. But the issues he'd witnessed were not isolated. They were systemic, and the idea that a single action could change the deep-rooted culture of elitism, prejudice, and exclusion in his company seemed, at that moment, both urgent and overwhelming. James knew he had to do more, much more. He returned to his office, his thoughts unwavering. His assistant Lisa was already there, going over the daily reports. The look on her face, however, told him that she was already aware of the situation at the store. She had been with him for years and knew his commitment to integrity. As much as she had admired his leadership, even she must have sensed that things were shifting. Things were about to get uncomfortable. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she greeted him, her voice steady but tinged with the slight unease she had been carrying all day. "How did it go?" James set his briefcase on the desk and sank into the chair behind him. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the polished surface of the desk. "Richard is gone," he said simply, though his voice carried an undercurrent of resolve. Lisa blinked, her eyebrows arching slightly. "Gone? Just like that?" James nodded. "Just like that." It wasn't an easy decision, but it had to be done. He was undermining everything the brand stands for, and I couldn't let that continue. Lisa didn't speak immediately, but her eyes gave away a trace of concern. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "What's the next step?" James leaned forward, his expression serious. "Now we clean up the mess, Lisa. It's not just about firing someone and calling it a day. It's about changing the culture, the way we approach customers, and the way we interact with them. I've been blind to this for too long." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Lisa's gaze softened as she watched James. He was a man known for his precision, for his ability to steer his company through turbulent waters. Yet here he was, looking at the remnants of his oversight, a realization dawning on him that would change everything. His empire had been built on principles of luxury and exclusivity, but he had come to see that those principles were deeply flawed. They were exclusionary. "James, you've always been about excellence," Lisa said after a long pause, her voice steady. "But I think you're right. This brand has gotten too focused on the wrong kind of exclusivity. We need to ensure that we're representing true luxury, the kind that values everyone, regardless of who they are." He looked up at her, meeting her eyes with a firm nod. "That's the vision I want to return to. We need to go back to the core of what this company was meant to be. A brand that makes everyone feel welcome, not just those with the right look or the right income." "Do you have a plan?" Lisa asked. James stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. The city stretched out before him, a landscape of endless possibilities. His thoughts were no longer just about how to fix the current situation, but how to rebuild his brand into something truly meaningful. It wasn't enough to change one store. The change had to be felt in every corner of the company, in every interaction, in every store across the country. "I do," he replied, his voice low but filled with purpose. "First things first, we need to start at the top. I'm going to replace Richard with someone who understands our values, someone who embodies inclusivity and respect. I don't want a manager who sees the customers as targets, but as people who deserve respect, regardless of how they dress or how much money they have." Lisa nodded, taking a deep breath. "That's a big step, James, but I know you're capable of it." James turned to face her, a glint of determination in his eyes. "I'm not just capable, Lisa. I will do it, but we'll need to do this in phases. First, the new manager, someone who believes in the values I've set, and then retraining the staff, especially the senior team. I want to focus on changing their mindset, ensuring that everyone in our company is committed to making customers feel valued." "Understood," Lisa replied, her voice firm now. "What else?" James leaned forward, his fingers laced together. "I'm going to visit the stores, not as the CEO, but as a regular customer. I need to see how the staff are interacting with our clients, to see if they're genuinely living our values or if they're simply going through the motions." Lisa looked at him, slightly taken aback. "You're going undercover again?" He gave a small smile, but there was no humor in it. "Yes, I need to know the truth. It's the only way we can move forward." Lisa walked over to the desk, her expression serious. "I'll help with the logistics. We'll make sure we're ready for the changes you want to implement. You won't be alone in this, James. James gave a slight nod, his gaze distant for a moment as he reflected on the gravity of the task ahead. I know, and I appreciate that. The following morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the skyscrapers of Manhattan, James Carter was already out the door, heading toward one of his luxury stores. This wasn't a typical visit. Today, he wasn't arriving with the aura of a CEO. Today, he was going undercover, once again, to observe the ground reality of what had been happening under his watch. His decision to step back into his stores as a regular customer was not just about getting feedback. It was about confronting the truth. The city seemed like a different place this morning. As James navigated the crowded streets, the city felt quieter, almost introspective. He wasn't just walking through New York's bustling energy, he was walking through it with a sense of responsibility, a deep, pressing need to make things right. With every step he took, he felt the weight of his decision to change his company's culture. The future of his brand, the values that he wanted to instill, hinged on moments like this. It wasn't going to be easy. James arrived at the store in question, an upscale boutique that had once felt like the epitome of elegance and luxury. But the moment he stepped inside, he immediately felt the dissonance. The atmosphere was pristine, as always, the marble floors gleaming and the displays as meticulously arranged as ever. But there was a certain coldness to it, an unspoken barrier between the staff and the customers that made it feel more like a high-priced museum than a store for genuine shopping. He stood still for a moment, allowing the environment to wash over him. The faint strains of classical music floated in the background, blending with the soft murmur of conversations. But beneath the polished surface, he could sense the tension. The employees were on edge, their polite smiles almost rehearsed. They didn't seem genuinely engaged with the customers. It was as if they were just going through the motions, checking boxes instead of building real connections. James moved slowly, blending into the crowd, observing. His eyes scanned the faces of the staff, noting the subtle signs of disinterest. One of the junior salespeople barely made eye contact with a woman who had been looking at a pair of designer shoes for several minutes, leaving her to wonder if she was being ignored. Another employee seemed to be more focused on his phone than assisting a couple browsing through high-end jewelry. James could feel his frustration building. This was exactly the kind of behavior he had hoped to weed out, but it was still here, lurking beneath the surface. He needed to understand if this was a systemic issue, if it was just bad training, or if the toxic culture had seeped into the staff's very way of interacting with customers. He knew the answer wouldn't come easily, but he was ready to dig deeper. As he moved further into the store, he spotted Sarah Moore, the new interim manager he had appointed. She was overseeing a small group of sales associates, giving instructions with the kind of calm professionalism James had hoped to see. Sarah seemed to be the only one exuding the values of inclusivity and customer care he wanted the brand to stand for. He watched her interact with a young man who had come in to look at a watch. She took the time to explain the features of the piece, asking him questions about his preferences and listening attentively as he spoke. It was a stark contrast to the way the other staff members were operating. James quietly observed from a distance, feeling a sense of pride. He had made the right decision in promoting Sarah to this position. Her demeanor was warm, welcoming, and sincere, everything the brand needed to embody. But there was something else he had noticed. Despite her best efforts, the store's overall atmosphere remained cold. The other employees, though polite, were disconnected from the values he wanted to instill. Sarah was fighting an uphill battle, and James could see it. As he watched, Sarah caught sight of him. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. She knew who he was now. She had seen him around the office, in meetings, and now he was standing there, observing the store firsthand. But there was no surprise, no awkwardness in her reaction. Instead, Sarah gave him a small, welcoming smile before she returned her focus to the customer she was assisting. James walked toward her, deciding it was time to speak. As he approached, he could see that Sarah was still maintaining her professional composure, but her eyes reflected the same frustration he was feeling. This wasn't the easy solution he had imagined, and it wasn't going to be solved by a few policy changes. The culture of elitism and exclusivity had a long way to go before it could truly change. Sarah, James said, his voice calm but firm. Can we talk for a moment? She turned to him, nodding politely. Of course, Mr. Carter. Is everything all right? I've seen a lot of things I'm not happy with, he said, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the dynamics. The way some of the customers are treated, the disconnection among the staff. It's not what I expected. Sarah glanced over at the salespeople, who were still going through the motions, barely engaged with the customers. I know, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of the challenge she faced. I've been trying to instill some changes, but it's been difficult. Some of the staff are resistant. They're so used to the old ways. They're used to treating customers differently, depending on how they look or how much they spend. It's not easy to change that mindset overnight. James nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The deeper issue wasn't just bad training. It was a culture that had been fostered over time, a culture that placed image above substance. It was going to take more than just a few training sessions or policy changes. It was going to take a fundamental shift in the way the staff saw their customers, in the way they saw their roles as representatives of the brand. I know it's not going to be easy, James said, his voice steady, but we're not just changing policies, we're changing people's perspectives. I'm going to need your help with this, Sarah. You're the one who understands what this brand is supposed to stand for. You're the one who can make this work. Sarah's eyes softened, and she gave a small nod. I'm ready. I won't let you down. I know you won't, James replied, his gaze locking with hers. We're going to need to make some hard decisions. There are going to be staff members who don't fit with what we're trying to do here, and they'll need to be let go. Sarah took a deep breath. I understand. I'll make sure the team is on board with this change. James gave a small smile. Good. We start with the people who are already here. But we'll also need to hire new blood, people who understand that luxury is about respect, not just about what someone wears or how much they spend. The conversation was over, but James knew this was just the beginning. Sarah was the right person to lead the store into the future, but she couldn't do it alone. James had decided to change things from the top down, and it was clear that there was still a long road ahead. But at least now he felt a sense of resolve, a sense of clarity that he hadn't felt before. The company he had built would evolve, and it would be stronger for it. As he walked out of the store, James looked back one last time. The changes had already begun, but they would take time. For now, he had to trust Sarah to keep the momentum going. It was time to start rebuilding, one store at a time. The sun had barely risen the next morning when James Carter found himself once again walking the familiar streets of New York. This time, however, his mission was more pressing. The decision to make changes had already been set in motion, but as he passed his company's flagship store, he felt a strange sense of both satisfaction and unease. The steps he had taken yesterday with Sarah were encouraging, but the reality was sinking in. He wasn't just making superficial changes. He was dismantling a culture that had been built over the years, and rebuilding it would require more than just a few quick fixes. It would demand patience, vigilance, and, most of all, unwavering commitment. James knew he couldn't afford to wait. There was too much at stake and too many questions left unanswered. His visit to the store had revealed the surface-level cracks in the culture, but he knew deeper issues still lurked beneath. It wasn't enough to simply address the staff's behavior. He needed to understand the root of the problem, the biases that had become so deeply embedded in the company's culture, even in its most senior ranks. It wasn't just Richard's attitude that had to change. It was the way everyone viewed their role, their customers, and their brand. Today, James was heading to another store, one located in the heart of the city's financial district. This location had always been one of his most profitable, but James had heard rumors that the culture there was just as toxic as it had been at the first store. He knew he needed to dig deeper to see how widespread the issue truly was. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he was ready to face it head-on. If his brand was going to thrive, it needed to shed the outdated ideas that had been holding it back. As James approached the store, he could feel the familiar hum of excitement mixed with anxiety. The sleek glass building reflected the morning sun, and the elegant storefront beckoned passers-by. Inside, the store was busy, with affluent customers browsing the latest collections. The atmosphere seemed upscale, polished, and exclusive, exactly as it should be. But as James stepped inside, he immediately sensed something was off. The energy in the room was cold. The staff moved with robotic efficiency, their interactions with the customers brief and transactional. There was no warmth, no effort to engage with the people walking through the doors. It was as though the store's identity had become entirely about the products and not the people who were supposed to enjoy them. James stood quietly in the corner, observing. The sales associates were polite enough, but their lack of enthusiasm was palpable. He saw a couple walk into the store, their clothing not quite fitting the typical luxury customer profile. They were greeted with indifference, the sales associate offering a quick, almost dismissive nod before turning away to assist someone else. The couple lingered, clearly uncertain whether they belonged, but neither was offered the attention or service they deserved. James clenched his jaw, the frustration he had been holding back beginning to bubble to the surface. It was then that he spotted Mark, the store manager. Mark was speaking to a customer, but the conversation was stiff and uncomfortable. Mark's eyes flicked over the customer's clothing, scanning for signs of wealth, as though measuring the person's worth by the brand they wore. The interaction was transactional at best, dismissive at worst. There was no effort to understand what the customer was truly looking for, only a focus on the sale. James could feel the divide between the staff and the customers, and it was exactly what he had feared. He made his way toward Mark, his footsteps deliberate. The moment Mark saw him, his demeanor shifted. He straightened up, offering a tight smile, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Mark didn't recognize him immediately, and James knew this was the moment he had been waiting for. He wasn't here as a CEO. He was just another customer in the eyes of the staff. The truth, he hoped, would reveal itself in this unfiltered moment. "Mark," James said, his voice steady, his eyes locking with the manager's, "I wanted to ask you about the customer service here." Mark looked at him, his smile faltering slightly. "Of course, sir. Is there something you'd like to see? We have some of our newest pieces in stock." James raised a hand to stop him. "I'm not here to buy anything today. I'm here to observe. I've been watching how the staff interacts with the customers. I don't think it's what we're supposed to represent." Mark's expression shifted from polite professionalism to defensive. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean. We offer the best products and a premium shopping experience. I've always made sure our staff maintains the image of the brand." James didn't flinch. He wasn't here to placate Mark's ego. He had a point to make, and it needed to be heard. "Your staff is cold. They're transactional. It's not just about the products, Mark. It's about the experience. We're supposed to be a place where customers feel welcome, not a high-priced boutique where they feel judged based on their clothing or their appearance." Mark opened his mouth to argue, but James cut him off before he could speak. "I've seen the way some of the customers are treated, the way your team judges them before they even speak. You make assumptions about who can afford to be here and who can't. That's not luxury, that's exclusion." Mark's face flushed slightly, his eyes darting around the store as if looking for an escape. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly, his voice tinged with frustration. "We serve high-end clients. They expect exclusivity. That's why they come to us." "Exclusivity," James repeated, his voice hard. "That's what you think luxury is? Exclusivity is about creating a space where people feel valued, not excluded. It's about treating everyone with dignity, whether they're wearing a suit or a t-shirt. What you've built here is a brand that puts image over substance, and that's not the vision I have for this company." Mark didn't say anything in response. His face was a mixture of disbelief and frustration, but James could see that the man understood exactly what he was saying. It wasn't that Mark didn't know how to do his job. It was that he had allowed the wrong values to permeate his management style, and now those values were spilling over into how his team treated customers. "You're out of touch," James said finally, his voice low but unwavering. "This store needs leadership that understands what true luxury is about, and you're not it." Mark's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. James turned away from him, walking slowly toward the door. As he reached for the handle, he glanced back at the store. This was a moment of reckoning, both for the company and himself. There would be no more compromises. The changes had to be sweeping, and they had to start now. James knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The next few days after his visit to the store had been a whirlwind of decisions, conversations, and realizations. The uncomfortable truth was that James had discovered what he had long suspected. His company, despite its reputation, was fostering an environment that prioritized the wrong values. The toxic exclusivity he had seen in his stores wasn't just the result of a few bad employees, it was a systemic issue. A problem that had slowly infiltrated every corner of his brand, one that had crept into the corporate culture and embedded itself deeply in how his teams interacted with customers. James had been trying to change this for years, but the realization hit him hard. He had allowed it to happen. He had been too focused on maintaining the image of luxury and success, too focused on growing the brand that he had overlooked the very thing that had brought him to this point: the customers. The people who trusted him to deliver not just luxury, but a genuine, respectful experience. As he sat in his office looking over the reports from his latest store visits, James felt a deep sense of urgency. The changes he had started to implement in the stores were only the beginning. He knew it was going to take time, but there was a pressing need for more immediate action. His patience was running thin. There were certain things that couldn't be ignored any longer. People's careers, lives, and reputations were at stake. James sat up in his chair, his gaze sharp. He knew what had to be done next. There was one person left who needed to be confronted. The one person who held the keys to the old guard of the company, his chief operating officer, Robert Hayes. Robert had been with the company for years, and while he was efficient, calculating, and had always been able to maintain the day-to-day operations of the business, he had never once questioned the company's approach to luxury and exclusivity. He believed that image was everything, and it was clear to James that Robert was unwilling to change. James had called Robert into his office that morning. He wasn't sure how the conversation would go, but he knew it was necessary. Robert needed to understand that the company's trajectory was changing, whether he liked it or not. When Robert walked into the office, James stood to greet him, offering a curt handshake. Robert was tall with a commanding presence. His dark suit and neatly styled hair gave him an air of authority that he had earned over the years. But today there was a noticeable shift in the air. James wasn't here for small talk. He wasn't here to discuss profits, margins, or the latest sales numbers. He was here to talk about the future and how Robert's involvement in it was no longer guaranteed if he didn't change his mindset. "Robert," James began, his voice calm but firm, "I've made some decisions, and I think you and I need to have a serious conversation." Robert sat down in the chair across from James, his posture stiff, his gaze carefully guarded. "I'm all ears, James," he replied, his voice smooth. But James could tell he was already on the defensive. "What's going on?" James took a breath, steadying himself before speaking. "I've spent the last few days visiting our stores, speaking with the staff, and watching how things are being run. I've seen the way we treat customers, the way we've been treating our employees, and I have to tell you, I'm not happy with what I've found." Robert's expression didn't change, but James saw the slight narrowing of his eyes. He knew Robert wasn't used to being challenged, especially on the company's core values. "What exactly are you referring to, James?" Robert asked. "I'm referring to the culture that's been allowed to fester in this company, Robert," James said, his voice low and controlled. "The culture of exclusion, the prioritization of appearance over substance, and the way we've allowed people to be judged based on how much they spend or what they wear. That's not what this brand was meant to stand for. And frankly, it's not what I'm willing to tolerate any longer." Robert leaned forward, his tone becoming more defensive. "James, we've built this company on exclusivity and high standards. That's what sets us apart from every other brand out there. People want to feel special when they come into our stores. They want to know they're getting the best, and that means offering them a level of service that is in line with our image." James shook his head slowly. "That's where you're wrong. The problem is that we've confused luxury with elitism. We've created an environment where only certain people are made to feel valued, and that's not the legacy I want for this brand. I'm tired of hiding behind an image that has no substance. I want a brand that treats everyone with respect, no matter who they are or how much money they have." Robert's lips tightened into a thin line. "You can't just throw away years of branding, James. You can't change everything overnight. Our customers expect a certain level of prestige, a certain standard of service, and we've built that reputation for a reason. I'm not throwing away our reputation, Robert, James countered, his voice firm. I'm taking it back. I'm making sure that our brand represents real luxury. Luxury that's inclusive, not exclusive. Luxury that makes every customer feel special, regardless of their background. And you need to decide whether or not you're on board with that vision. For a moment, Robert was silent, his eyes narrowing as he processed James's words. James could see the internal struggle in his eyes. Robert was a man who had built his career around maintaining an image, and the idea of shifting that image so drastically was clearly difficult for him to accept. But James wasn't interested in comfort. He was interested in progress. You don't get it, do you? James continued, his voice calm but resolute. You've been so focused on the image that you've forgotten about the people, the customers, the employees. This brand should be about more than just selling expensive products. It should be about making people feel welcome, making them feel valued. I've always believed in quality, James, Robert replied, his voice hardening. And that means having standards. If you're telling me that we're going to abandon our standards to accommodate everyone, then I can't be a part of this anymore. James felt a pang of disappointment, but his resolve only strengthened. Then it looks like this is where our paths diverge, he said softly, his voice never wavering. I can't move forward with someone who refuses to change. Your position is no longer viable here, Robert. I'm letting you go. Robert stared at him for a moment, his face hardening with anger. You'll regret this, he muttered, standing up abruptly. This company was built on exclusivity, and without it, you'll lose everything. James stood, watching as Robert turned to leave. Maybe, he said quietly, but I'd rather lose everything than lose what truly matters. As Robert stormed out of the office, James felt a sense of relief wash over him. The decision had been hard, but necessary. He knew it wasn't going to be easy to rebuild, but he also knew that the future of his company depended on these difficult choices. It was time for a new era, and James was ready to lead it. The days following Robert's departure felt like a turning point for James Carter. It was as though the weight that had hung over him for so long had finally lifted, but in its place was the responsibility of shaping a future that would be vastly different from the past. The decision to remove Robert was difficult, but it was necessary. James knew that the shift he envisioned for his company could not happen with individuals still anchored to the old ways, especially those who placed image above substance, exclusivity above inclusivity. Now, as he sat in his office overlooking the bustling streets of New York, James felt the gravity of the changes he was about to make. There was no going back now. He had started this journey to reclaim his brand's soul, and the path ahead would be one of renewal, a process that would require reshaping not only the internal culture of the company, but also the very essence of what it stood for. James wasn't just looking to make a few adjustments to policies or marketing strategies. This was about creating a new standard for luxury, one rooted in human connection, authenticity, and respect for all people, regardless of their background or appearance. It wasn't about wealth or status. It was about creating an environment where customers felt seen, valued, and understood. That morning, James called for a meeting with the company's leadership team. He had made the decision to appoint Sarah Moore as the new chief operating officer, a role she would now assume with full responsibility for driving the cultural and operational transformation he wanted to see. Sarah had proven herself time and again in her position as interim store manager. Her professionalism, empathy, and commitment to inclusivity had already begun to reshape the flagship store, and James knew she was the right person to lead this change. As Sarah entered the conference room, she was met with a warm but determined smile from James. He had already discussed her promotion with Lisa, and everyone knew that the company was entering a new chapter. It was now up to Sarah to take charge, to navigate this transformative period, and to ensure that the values of respect, inclusivity, and customer-first service were instilled at every level. Sarah, thank you for joining me, James began, motioning for her to sit across from him at the long, polished table. I know this is a huge responsibility, but you've proven yourself to be someone who understands our vision better than anyone else. That's why I've made the decision to offer you the position of Chief Operating Officer. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, though there was no hesitation in her response. I'm honored, James. You can count on me. I know there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm ready for it. James nodded, his voice steady. The work ahead won't be easy, but it's necessary. We've spent too much time focusing on the wrong aspects of luxury. This company has been built on the idea of exclusivity, but I want to shift that focus. Luxury should be about creating a space where everyone feels respected and valued, not just the people who fit a certain image. We need to change the way our stores operate, the way we treat our customers, and most importantly, the way we see our staff. Sarah leaned forward, listening intently. I agree completely. I've already started to see the effects of this shift at the stores, but it's going to take more than just a few changes on the floor. We need to start with leadership, and we need to ensure that every manager is aligned with our new values. If we can get the leadership on board, the rest will follow. James looked at her, his gaze serious. That's exactly right. I'm going to need your help in leading the training and development for our leadership team. We need to ensure that the managers, especially the senior ones, understand the importance of this cultural shift. We can't afford to have anyone in a leadership position who isn't fully committed to our new direction. I'll get started on it immediately, Sarah said with determination. We'll have a clear plan, and we'll get all our leadership on the same page. But I'll need your support in making sure the changes stick. I'll need you to be visible, to show the rest of the company that this is more than just a shift in policy. It's a shift in how we operate at the most fundamental level. James smiled, the weight of the decision behind him now. You have my full support, Sarah. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure this vision is realized. But this needs to be about more than just leadership. We need to involve every employee in this change. This isn't just about us at the top, it's about the entire company. It's about creating an environment where everyone, no matter their role, feels empowered to contribute to this new culture. Sarah nodded in agreement. I think that's key. We need to involve everyone. From our entry-level staff to our senior managers, everyone needs to feel like they're part of this transformation. They need to understand that this is about people, not just profits. It's about respect. James stood up, a sense of resolve filling him. Exactly. And to kickstart this process, I'm going to make a public announcement, one that will set the tone for everything to come. I want the world to know that this is a company that values people, that treats everyone equally, and that luxury is about making people feel welcome. It's not about making them feel small because they don't fit a certain mold. We will be transparent about our intentions, and we will hold ourselves accountable for the changes we make. Sarah stood as well, the weight of the responsibility clear in her eyes. I'm ready for that challenge, James. We're going to make this work. We have to. James smiled, a sense of pride welling up in him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was a road worth traveling. They had the right leadership, the right vision, and most importantly, the right values. Let's do this, he said, extending his hand to Sarah. As they shook hands, both of them knew that this was the beginning of something new. The brand was changing, not just for its customers, but for everyone involved. And this time, they were going to build something that would last. In the days that followed, James and Sarah worked tirelessly, setting the foundation for the changes that would ripple through every level of their company. The leadership team was called to a series of meetings, where Sarah, with James's full support, laid out the new direction for the brand. It wasn't about making empty promises or superficial changes. It was about creating a sustainable, long-term shift in the company's culture. They needed to tear down old barriers and replace them with a focus on inclusivity, empathy, and respect. The first order of business was a leadership training program. Every senior manager, every store manager, and every department head had to go through it. This was non-negotiable. The goal was clear. They needed to understand that their role wasn't just to push sales or maintain the brand's image. It was to represent the core values of respect and inclusivity, treating every customer as they would want to be treated themselves. The first session began in the company's conference room, where Sarah had organized a full-day training seminar. The walls of the room were lined with screens that displayed images of the company's past, glamorous ads, high-end products, and sleek designs. James and Sarah stood in front of the room, ready to kick things off. The room was full of senior managers who had been with the company for years, many of whom had been resistant to the idea of change. James stepped to the front, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the murmurs of the room. Thank you all for being here. Today marks the beginning of something important for this company. You've all been part of the success we've experienced, and I want to ensure that we continue to grow, but we need to grow in the right direction. We need to create an environment that welcomes all customers, not just those who fit a certain image or status. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. James looked around at the faces of the managers. He could tell some were skeptical, some were simply going through the motions, but he knew this was the moment to challenge them to change. This wasn't just about policies or procedures, it was about their mindset. Sarah picked up the baton. We've spent too long focusing on the wrong things. We've been obsessed with who looks the part, who fits our idea of luxury. But real luxury, the kind we're going to represent going forward, is about making people feel seen, heard, and respected, no matter who they are or what they wear. That's what we need to instill in our teams, and it starts with us. She paused, letting the message sink in. Some of the managers exchanged glances. The tension was palpable, but Sarah knew they had to confront the discomfort head on. She wasn't here to make people comfortable. She was here to make them change. The rest of the day was spent going over practical steps: how to train staff to recognize and challenge their own biases, how to engage customers in ways that made them feel valued, how to foster an environment of inclusion and respect. It was grueling work, but Sarah and James knew it was necessary. The changes they were asking the leadership team to embrace weren't just about customer interactions. They were about personal growth and self-reflection. By the end of the session, the room had shifted. The resistance had lessened. It wasn't gone, but the conversation had started. Some of the managers were even asking insightful questions, genuinely engaged in the process. Sarah and James knew they had planted the seed, but they were far from done. The next step was ensuring that this culture of respect trickled down to every level of the company. After the training session, Sarah and James took the time to meet with the store managers individually. It was important to James that they understood the gravity of the changes. They were no longer just store managers, they were ambassadors of a new company ethos. Their job wasn't just to oversee the operations of the store, it was to lead by example, to show their teams that inclusivity and respect were more than just buzzwords. They were the foundation of a thriving, sustainable business. One by one, James and Sarah met with the managers. They listened to concerns, offered guidance, and reiterated the company's new mission. Some managers expressed reservations, while others were fully on board. But one thing was clear: the culture of elitism and exclusivity was no longer going to be tolerated. If a manager didn't fully embrace the new values, they wouldn't be leading a store for much longer. In the days that followed, the ripple effects were felt throughout the company. There was a noticeable shift in the way customers were being treated, especially in the stores that had the most resistance to change. Staff began engaging more openly with customers, striking up conversations, and offering assistance without judgment. Customers who had once felt out of place in the high-end boutiques were now treated like valued guests, not because of their wealth, but because they were human beings worthy of respect. James received feedback from the stores, and while the changes were still in their early stages, the improvement was undeniable. Sales weren't the focus, but the customer experience was better than it had ever been. Customers walked out of the stores with a sense of pride, having been treated with dignity and care. It was the kind of experience James had always envisioned, but had never fully realized until now. The most telling moment came a week later, when James visited one of the stores anonymously. He wanted to see for himself how the changes were being implemented, without the pressure of his title looming over the staff. As he walked through the doors, he was greeted by a young sales associate who smiled warmly and asked if he needed help. James could tell she had been trained well. She was confident, warm, and eager to assist, without a trace of the previous aloofness that had once defined the brand's atmosphere. The experience was a validation of everything they had worked for. James took a moment to reflect as he walked through the store, taking in the positive energy, the genuine interactions between customers and staff, and the way the space felt alive with possibility. Sarah's vision was beginning to take shape. The new era of the brand was no longer just a dream. It was becoming a reality. Despite the visible progress in customer interactions and the growing positive feedback from the stores, James knew that the shift he had started was not without its challenges. The real test, he realized, would not be in the immediate changes, but in the long-term sustainability of the cultural transformation. It was one thing to shift the approach at the top levels of management, but it was entirely another to ensure that the new values took root at every level of the company. The real battle was not just about changing policies, it was about changing mindsets, and that would take time. In the weeks following the training sessions, Sarah worked tirelessly to ensure that the changes were not just superficial. She held regular meetings with store managers, checking in on their progress, addressing concerns, and making sure they were staying true to the new mission. She wasn't just overseeing day-to-day operations anymore. She was overseeing a cultural revolution, and the pressure was mounting. James could sense the strain in Sarah's voice whenever they spoke. The responsibility was enormous, and although she had proven herself time and again, James knew the road ahead would be long. He was there to support her, of course, but he also knew that the hardest work was being done by Sarah and the store managers themselves. The biggest hurdle was not just changing the way employees treated customers, it was changing how they saw themselves and their roles within the company. But it wasn't just Sarah who was feeling the pressure. There were murmurs among the senior staff, some of whom were still resistant to the changes. They had seen how the company had operated for years, and for many of them, the idea of radically altering the culture felt risky. They worried that James's vision would alienate the long-time loyal customers who had been drawn to the brand's exclusivity. They feared that by opening the doors to a broader, more diverse customer base, the luxury of the brand would be diluted. James understood these concerns. He had once shared them, but he also knew that luxury, in its truest form, was about more than just the price tag on a product. It was about the experience, the feelings it evoked, and the way it made someone feel seen and valued. The inclusivity he was striving for wasn't just about inviting more people into the store. It was about creating a culture where everyone, no matter their background or appearance, could experience the same high level of service and where they would leave feeling like they were part of something meaningful. However, as James spent more time at the stores, visiting without notice, he began to see subtle signs of resistance. In one of the flagship locations, he observed a senior associate, Carol, who had been with the company for over 15 years. She was assisting a well-dressed woman, and everything seemed fine on the surface. Until the customer asked about a new collection, James overheard Carol's response, which was polite but dismissive. "It's not really for someone like you," she said with a thin smile, alluding to the customer's apparent lack of interest in the high-end collection, despite the woman's visible wealth. James felt the anger rising in his chest as he watched the interaction unfold. Carol didn't know who he was, but that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the behavior she was demonstrating. She was still treating customers differently based on their perceived status, judging them not by who they were, but by how they looked and how much they were willing to spend. James didn't confront her right away. He wanted to give her the opportunity to change, to correct her behavior on her own, but it was clear that the old attitudes were still lingering. When the customer left, James approached Carol, his demeanor calm but stern. "Carol, can I have a word with you?" She looked up, startled, and immediately straightened her posture. "Of course, Mr. Carter. What can I do for you?" "I overheard your conversation with that customer," James began, his voice steady. "You said something to her that didn't sit right with me." "It was dismissive, Carol. It was the kind of attitude that we've worked hard to eliminate. It's not about who people appear to be, it's about how we treat them. You need to understand that." Carol's face flushed with embarrassment, but there was a trace of defensiveness in her eyes. "I didn't mean anything by it," she said quickly, but James could hear the hesitation in her voice. "I just assumed—" "Exactly," James interjected. "You assumed, and that's the problem. You made a judgment about her based on how she looked, not on who she was or what she came here for. We're in the business of treating everyone with respect, no matter their background or appearance." Carol opened her mouth to respond, but the words faltered. She knew he was right. The realization seemed to hit her slowly, like a wave of understanding. I, I see what you mean, Mr. Carter. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. James nodded. I hope so, Carol. This is about creating a culture of inclusivity. We can't afford to keep making the same mistakes. Every customer who walks through those doors deserves to feel valued. James turned to leave, but then paused. We're not just selling products here. We're selling an experience. We're creating a space where everyone belongs. If we don't get that right, none of this matters. Do you understand? Carol nodded, her face now a mixture of guilt and determination. Yes, I do. James left the store feeling a sense of relief, but he knew this was only one instance. There would be many more. This wasn't going to be a quick fix. It was going to be a slow, painful process of unlearning and relearning for many of his employees. But he also knew this was the only way forward. The shift, however, wasn't just about correcting individuals. James understood that to truly make a difference, it had to be reflected in the company's values every single day. There would be no shortcuts. He needed to ensure that this new culture was embedded in the very DNA of the company. As the weeks passed, the changes were felt more profoundly. Sales began to rise, but more importantly, the atmosphere in the stores began to change. Customers walked in and were greeted by a level of warmth they had never experienced before. The once unspoken judgment that had characterized the company's past was being replaced by genuine service, and that made all the difference. But James knew there was still a long road ahead. There were still barriers to break down, and he would continue to fight for a future where respect and inclusivity weren't just ideals. They were the core of everything the company stood for. Months had passed since the initial changes had begun, and the transformation within James Carter's company was now undeniable. The vision he had worked so hard to implement was beginning to take shape, not just in the polished floors and elegant displays of his stores, but in the hearts and minds of his staff and customers alike. What had once been a brand defined by exclusivity, elitism, and status was slowly becoming a company rooted in authenticity, inclusivity, and respect. But James knew that this was not the end of the journey. It was only the beginning of a much larger transformation. As the company evolved, James found himself reflecting on the larger implications of the changes he had set in motion. The business was more than just a company now. It had become a living embodiment of his values. It was no longer just about luxury. It was about making people feel valued, about showing them that their worth wasn't tied to how much money they had or what they looked like. It was about fostering an environment where everyone, regardless of their background, appearance, or financial standing, was treated with dignity and respect. James stood at the head of the conference room as he prepared to address the team for the first time since the full-scale implementation of the cultural shift. Sarah, his chief operating officer, stood beside him, her presence a reminder of the incredible work she had done to help carry out the vision that had begun in his mind. Together they had overseen a radical transformation, but they both knew the work wasn't over yet. It was time to bring everyone together and share with them how far they had come and how far they still had to go. The room was filled with department heads, senior managers, and key staff members from all over the company. They had gathered to hear the state of the brand and its future direction. James had been planning this meeting for weeks. He knew that this moment was crucial. It was the time to reaffirm the company's mission, solidify its new direction, and rally the entire team around a common goal. But above all, it was time to celebrate the progress they had made together. Good morning, everyone, James began, his voice calm but filled with conviction. I want to start by thanking each of you for the hard work, dedication, and passion you've put into the changes we've made. When I first started this journey, I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew that changing a company's culture, especially one as ingrained in its old ways as ours, would be a long, difficult road. But look at where we are now. He paused, letting the room soak in the weight of his words. The atmosphere was different now. There was a sense of unity, of shared purpose in the air. The cynicism that had once plagued the company had begun to fade, replaced by a renewed commitment to the brand's new values. James continued, his eyes scanning the room. We've made a lot of progress. Our stores are now more welcoming than ever. Our customers are feeling respected, valued, and heard in a way that they never have before. And that's because of all of you, because of the way you've embraced this transformation and made it your own. He turned to Sarah, who stood beside him. She smiled, her pride evident. James had trusted her with the responsibility of leading the operational side of the change, and she had delivered. But she had also brought something else to the table, a genuine passion for customer care and a determination to see the values of respect and inclusivity woven into the fabric of every store, every interaction, and every policy. Sarah, I want to thank you for everything you've done, James said, his voice softening. You've not only helped lead this transformation, you've embodied it. You've shown everyone what true leadership looks like. Your commitment to ensuring that these values are not just preached but practiced has been crucial in making this change happen. Sarah smiled at him, but there was no smugness in her expression. She had worked hard to make this vision a reality, and she knew that they still had a long way to go. But the changes they had made were already starting to bear fruit. The feedback from the stores was overwhelmingly positive. Staff were engaged, customers were happier, and most importantly, the culture of elitism and exclusivity that had once dominated their operations was being replaced with a more inclusive, human-centered approach. James addressed the team again. But let's be clear about one thing. This is not the end. It's only the beginning. We've made great strides, but the work doesn't stop here. We have to continue to evolve. We have to continue to hold ourselves accountable to the standards we've set. And that means ensuring that this culture change sticks, that it's not just a moment in time, but a permanent shift in how we do business. He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in. From here on out, every decision we make, from the way we hire and train our staff to the way we market our products, will be influenced by the values we hold dear. And that means creating a company that isn't just a brand, it's a community where respect, inclusivity, and empathy are the core principles that drive everything we do. There was a murmur of agreement around the room. James could feel the energy shifting again, this time in a more positive direction. The resistance that had once been prevalent in the company had all but dissipated. The leaders in the room now understood the stakes. They knew that the success of the company going forward depended on their commitment to the new vision. We're also going to take this message beyond our stores, James continued, a spark of enthusiasm in his voice. We'll be transparent with the public about the changes we're making. We'll own the fact that we've had shortcomings, but we'll also show them that we are committed to doing better. Our customers deserve nothing less. There was a sense of pride in the room now, a sense of ownership over the change they were collectively responsible for. James looked around, feeling a quiet satisfaction. The transformation was no longer an abstract idea. It was happening in real time, and it was creating something meaningful. They were not just selling luxury products anymore. They were selling a new kind of luxury, one rooted in human connection and respect for all. As the meeting drew to a close, James looked at Sarah. She gave him a nod of encouragement, and he knew that the journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but it was a journey worth taking. He was no longer just the CEO of a luxury brand. He was a leader in the truest sense of the word, leading a company that had become a beacon of respect, inclusion, and authenticity. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a long time, James felt confident in the direction his company was headed. Together, they were building a new legacy, a legacy defined not by who was excluded, but by who was welcomed. Lessons learned. True luxury is about respect and inclusivity, not exclusivity. One of the most significant lessons from this journey is that luxury isn't just about wealth, appearance, or status. True luxury lies in making everyone feel valued, regardless of their background or financial standing. A brand that only caters to a select group of people misses the opportunity to create genuine, lasting connections with its customers. True luxury comes from offering a welcoming experience where respect and inclusivity are the foundation. Cultural change takes time and commitment. Changing a company's culture is not an overnight process. It requires sustained effort and dedication. While immediate improvements can be seen, lasting change only happens when values are embedded into every aspect of the business. It's about challenging old assumptions, rethinking policies, and continuously reflecting on how employees and customers are treated. Leaders must be willing to face uncomfortable truths and take action, no matter how difficult it may seem. Leadership begins with self-reflection. Effective leadership starts with self-awareness. James's journey was as much about confronting his assumptions and blind spots as it was about transforming his company. As leaders, it's crucial to understand that the culture of an organization reflects its leaders. By holding himself accountable to the new values of respect and inclusivity, James set the tone for the rest of the company to follow. Leadership is about modeling the behavior you wish to see in others. Empathy is a key driver of success. Empathy is an essential ingredient for any business that seeks to foster lasting relationships. Whether with customers or employees, understanding the needs, concerns, and aspirations of others allows companies to create a more meaningful and engaging experience. When customers feel heard and valued, they are more likely to return and become loyal advocates for the brand. This empathy should be extended not just to customers, but also to staff, fostering an environment where everyone feels supported. Building a company culture requires all hands on deck. Cultural change isn't just the responsibility of the leadership team. It requires the participation of everyone within the company. James learned that by empowering individuals at all levels, from junior staff to senior managers, he could create a sense of shared responsibility for the transformation. It's crucial to engage employees in the process, provide them with the tools to succeed, and make them feel like active contributors to the company's mission. Branding is not just about image, but substance. The brand's identity should reflect the values it stands for, not just the image it projects to the outside world. Focusing solely on the image can lead to alienation and disconnection from customers who may not feel they belong. A brand built on genuine substance, on authenticity and respect, will attract a more diverse and loyal customer base. People can sense when a brand is being authentic, and they are more likely to support it when they believe it aligns with their values. Accountability is essential for long-term growth. Ensuring that the cultural shift is sustained requires accountability at every level. Whether it's through training, leadership development, or regular assessments, holding people accountable to the company's values ensures that the change is not just superficial. For a business to thrive, it must consistently evolve and adapt, and that evolution comes from a commitment to continuous improvement and self-reflection. The power of transparency and integrity. Being transparent with customers about the company's values, its challenges, and the steps it's taking to improve fosters trust and loyalty. Consumers want to feel that the brands they support are genuine and open about their efforts to do better. Integrity, combined with transparency, builds a strong foundation for long-term relationships, both with customers and employees. The customer experience is at the heart of everything. Ultimately, a company's success is defined by how it treats its customers. Creating an experience that values people above all else will always lead to better business outcomes. Customers are not just transactional, they are human beings with their own unique stories, desires, and needs. The best companies listen, engage, and create memorable experiences that make customers feel like they matter. By embracing these lessons, businesses can build a stronger, more inclusive future, one that celebrates not just luxury, but humanity. These principles not only transform organizations, but also help create a positive impact on society as a whole,